Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. Limor Raviv. She is a research associate at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. Her research focuses on the cultural evolution of languages in different social environments. Specifically, she studies how the social structure of the environment affects the grammatical structure of languages. So Dr. Raviv, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. So, previously you were a doctoral student at Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, and I wanted to ask you, as a branch of linguistics, what are the kinds of questions that psycholinguistics tries to answer specifically?
So the idea of studying psycholinguistics is studying the interface between everything that's related to psychology or cognitive science, so what happens in the brain's perception of people, and the interface of language. So this means things like how do we produce language, how do we process language, how do we comprehend what we're listening to, and also this interplay between, so while we're talking, a lot of the time we're already planning what we're going to say next. And when we listen to someone else, we also already start planning how we're going to respond. So a lot of things are happening together at the same time. And that's really interesting to look at. There's also at the Institute work on well, actually, there are many departments. So how is language acquired in children? So language development and language learning. How is it to learn a second language? What is the process and the difference in learning a first language and a second language throughout childhood? There is a department on the neurobiology of language. So looking at things like fMRI and EEG, and really how the brain is processing and active while we are using and listening to language. There is a department about language and genetics, and this is a really interesting department, which the point is looking at genetic markers for language and especially language deficiencies. So people who have, for example, specific language disorders and so on, trying to locate genetic markers for that, and also to identify things that are related to language in other species, like bats, for example. So looking at vocal learning in other animals and so on. And in the psychology of language department, which is where I was, the main focus is exactly on how do people really, how do they take turns with each other? How do they act during conversation? And there's also an interesting thing to say about things like speech illusions and processing when you're in a noisy environment and so on. So really, everything you can think of that is related to our cognition and language.
Yeah, that's a really broad field then. Okay, and let me start by asking you about child development. Why is understanding how children acquire language so important in linguistics?
So I think this has to do with two different yet, of course, connected points. The first point is very trivial. It's that well, we all humans on Earth learn a language. Some languages are very different than others. Some languages are considered to be harder than others. This is an experience you have as an adult a lot of the time when you try to learn a new language. But children seem to magically do this. And it is really interesting to identify and crack what is it exactly that they're learning and how are they doing it. What are the mechanisms that they're using? And this is, of course, related to a very, let's say, long debate in the field of language acquisition as to, do they come with some built-in innate knowledge about what language should or should not be like? Or are they really learning it just like they learn any other thing in the world, just like you learn how to ride a bike? You don't have any innate knowledge of how to ride a bike. You really have to learn the basics from the motor learning, how to pedal and the balance and the street rules and so on. You can think of this analogy in language. You have to learn how to use your mouth and utter. You have to learn what each word means, and of course the grammar of the language. And a lot of people have argued that this is actually quite a complicated task to do. So that is one side. Basically, how do we do this super complicated task? And the second part is that a lot of people look at language acquisition as a mirror into, for example, language evolution or cognitive development. So to look at how, when you learn a language, those steps of what do you learn first, maybe they can kind of give us hints as to how language developed. A lot of the time, there is the idea that, well, children, they first start with, for example, single word utterances. They first learn how to point at things. Maybe later they combine it into two words, and only later comes, more complicated sentences. And even then, there are some sentences that are really complicated, and children learn much later in life. So maybe this kind of development in complexity can also say something about how language actually evolved in our species hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Mhm. Many interesting questions to explore there. So let's start with this one. Regarding the innateness or the innateness of language, or on the other hand, the developmental aspects of language, do we know to what extent language is innate in children and in people, or not?
That's a gigantic question, and I think it will. The answer will probably vary depending on who you're asking. But I come from a field where I don't believe language is innate. Of course, we have predispositions for language in the sense that children are definitely attentive to cues and to pointing, and they're ready to have some form of communication. We are a social species after all. But I don't think that any grammatical aspects of language are innate. So I don't think children are born with an idea of how language structure should look like. I really believe that they learn this from the environment, just as we learn, as we said, for example, riding a bike. Even when it comes to the vocals, to the motor skills of how exactly to utter sounds. If you think about it, it takes children actually quite a long time to learn how to master speech production and how to say the right sounds. So I think that is already quite a clear evidence that it's not something that is built in and they just open their mouth and suddenly know how to speak. And I think there's a lot of evidence for children learning language by statistical learning, basically picking up regularities in the environment. And the fact that if you look at language as basically a very complicated set of co-occurrences, things that tend to appear together, you can learn them just as you learn any other pattern in the world. And actually, I so far have not seen convincing evidence that children do not learn this way, that there is some magical box in the head that has a space for language when you are born. I definitely, as I said, I think we have a tendency for social connection, which means that even children who are born deaf, for example, or mute, they immediately, with their families already from infancy, try to find ways to communicate with their parents and their caretakers. But it's not the case that they have a full-blown language or nothing even close to this in their heads. And as evidence, it takes children quite some time to learn. So children until the age of even 5, and definitely before they go to school, they are still learning a lot of the grammar of their language. So in fact, it's a pretty long and tiresome process with a lot of errors. So I would say from my point of view, it's quite convincing that it's mostly. I don't see evidence that it would be innate. I think it's more convincing to say that we are a very complex, sophisticated learners, and we learn a very sophisticated behavior like language. in that way.
Okay, so according to that view, language acquisition would be the result of general domain cognitive mechanisms that we can also use to acquire other sorts of knowledge, correct?
Yes, one of the leading mechanisms for this is statistical learning, which is something that's been studied quite a lot. It's basically, statistical learning is a fancy name for our ability to pick up regularities in the environment and learn them over time. There's statistical learning when it comes to visual things, to tactile, definitely to auditory learning, so which things occur together. And in fact, there is almost nothing that cannot be learned using statistical learning. And statistical learning also highlights what is the rule, if there is any. So if you learn a lot of regularities over time, you start extrapolating, then what if there is some overarching pattern within the patterns you've learned? So this is also a way to kind of think of higher level learning. And yeah, so far we have this mechanism that seems to be acting in all domains. It may be slightly differently in each domain. So for example, visual statistical learning, when we learn patterns or shapes, seems to be much more attuned to spatial regularities, so things in space, this appears here and this appears here, and less to temporal regularities, so things like rhythm. But auditory learning is much more attuned to tempo and to what we call it basically time stamps, because that's in the auditory, things come and then immediately disappear. So you're much more sensitive to sequencing in time rather than where from in space it came from. So of course each system has its own sensitivities based on what it needs to learn. So they're not, in that sense, they're not identical across domains, but the same principles should apply across domains. Yeah.
But are children taught by older people how to speak? I mean, I'm asking you this because there's that poverty of the stimulus phenomenon that was pointed by people like Noam Chomsky, but I mean, is that really the case, that the stimulus to learn language coming from other people is poor, and so language would have to have some more innate cognitive mechanisms associated to it?
It's a great question, because indeed one of the arguments in favor of the innateness of language was this idea that the stimulus is poor. If you look at language, you can't possibly learn the rules. But actually this argument has very little support in reality. If anything, corpus studies that look at utterances of between adults and adults to children and so on often discover a very rich stimulus that you can definitely learn the pattern from. In fact, if you think about AIs and different deep learning models like Siri and so on, they learn from the stimulus and they learn pretty well. So maybe, of course, there are maybe some things that could be irregulars and quirks in the language, but even these things are present in the way people speak every day. So the idea that somehow the input is missing, I think is missing the point, because the input is in fact everything that can and possibly be said, or the patterns or the structures, it's all there for children to pick up. Some things are harder than others, for sure. Some patterns are really hard to pick up, and maybe they're also more rare. So there is, for example, a lot of basically a correlation between what is most frequent and what do children learn first. So the things that are the most frequent in the input, words that are most frequent, sentences or phrases that are most frequent, children pick that up in their first year. And more rare and sophisticated things that you maybe only see when you're in school, or only very rare occasions, yeah, they are learned much slower. And even as an adult, you're slower to process and respond to these things, even when you're a native speaker and with perfect comprehension. So yeah, I think the input is really rich. And for your question, whether children are taught language, I mean, there is a whole field of child-directed speech, or motherese, as was called in the past. It's the way adults talk to children is quite different than the way adults talk to each other. In some cultures, I have to say, not in all of them. There are some cultures around the world where child-directed speech, the way, this kind of highlighted, exaggerated, very slow way actually doesn't exist, and children learn the language also well. But maybe...
So it's not a human universal, right?
No, so there are researchers like Marisa Casillas at here the Max Planck University, and Alex Christia from École Normale Supérieure. They have went and did some field work with I would say unstudied or less understudied populations, and a lot of the times children are barely spoken to. Imagine I would say a more third world society where you have the baby on your back and you work in the field all day. You don't spend hours and hours talking to the baby, and definitely not with this excessive thing. But it's really hard to tell what impact this has on language learning. Eventually, all these children learn their mother tongue. But we don't necessarily know. Maybe they learn it slightly slower, or maybe the developmental process is a bit different, or maybe the language itself is also less sophisticated, because we know that, for example, literacy, so learning how to read and write, boosts your language complexity by a lot. So even if languages with no reading and writing system, that also don't have a lot of literature, often tend to have this super complicated sentence of he said that he thought that those things. Yeah, they don't exist in spoken language. They mostly exist in written language. So it's hard to tell what impact this has. But we know that mothers and caretakers definitely help children learn by repeating common phrases, by using specific things that are easier than others. This is a well-studied phenomenon. So I think arguing that the stimulus is poor or that children are not taught language, none of these things have actual grounding in the data. You can believe it if you want, and many people actually still believe it. But if you look at the evidence of how language is around us, it seems pretty clear that many people do teach language, and that's what we learn around us is pretty sophisticated and rich.
And not only that, but also the fact that babies, for example, or small children have a few years where they learn language. I mean, they don't become competent at language or fluent in it until they are, I don't know, perhaps 3 years old or something like that. Right?
Even more, exactly. This is the point. The idea that children learn language easily, I mean, maybe more easier than adults for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. But still, it is a long, tiresome process with a lot of mistakes. And I would say 3, it's even young. Children don't learn to use, for example, embedded clause until they are 3 or 4. And there are some structures in languages that may only appear at the age of 5 or 6, and other structures that only appear when children go to school and start learning how to read and write. So there is definitely steps in what makes a child a competent speaker. And I think it's a long process, for sure.
And by the way, talking about learning to read and write, are there any important differences in terms of language production between literate and pre-literate children?
Yeah, for sure, but not even with children, even with literate and pre-literate adults. If you go and look at pre-literate adults, and even in India or other societies, there is a big gap. This is many types of linguistic tasks, and I must say I'm not 100% sure. It's been a long time since I've read these things, but language processing, even things that are related to memory, learning how to read and write really impacts our brain. This is you can see this in the work by Dehan and work at people like actually, there's many. There's a whole field of studies on how literacy affects our brain, mostly by enhancing some features. And it gives us an extra tool, an extra way to represent language. That's one way to think about it. Other people like Inbal Arnon at the Hebrew University and her student, now actually her own associate professor, Naomi Hevron, they did a really interesting study that shows or tries to make the point that one of the reasons that we adults find it so hard to learn a second language is because we are literate, because we are already at the stage where we have coupled language and words, written words, in a way that when we come to learn a new language, we learn it together with the way it's written. Children don't do this. Children only hear spoken language and comprehend it, and they have no representation in the early stages of how these things map to written words, for example. So the idea is that maybe, first of all, we have a double task when we're adults. We have to learn two things at once. How something is sounding and used, and how it's written, spelled, and so on. That's sometimes really hard. And I'm not even talking of what happens when you learn a new writing system. That's even more intense. But actually, the way we learn it is different. The idea is that children, they hear sentences, they hear chunks, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 word sentences. And they learn them actually exactly as they is. They basically copy what they learn. So and over time they may learn that to segment these things into words. So think a nice example is think about good night. Children hear good night, good night, good night, and maybe it takes them some time to find out, oh, it's actually 2 words, good and night. How would you know this? When you hear the words, it's completely, you have no spaces. When we speak, barely, only in pauses, but they don't correspond to the spaces we have between words. So maybe it takes a while to learn that good is something else, maybe because it also appears in other sentences, like good boy. And over time, you're like, okay, I have segmented the word good. As an adult, you learn words in isolation. You learn good, you learn night, you learn boy, and your task is to make them into one sentence. And that's actually exactly the opposite than what children do when they learn. Mm-hmm. And that may explain why, for example, children are really fluent, even when they make a lot of mistakes. They seem to be pretty fluent in their overall sentences, but they're pretty bad at maybe the specific kind of small, fine-grained details. And adults, when they learn a second language, they are often much better than children in vocabulary, at least in the first year. If you put adults and children to learn a new language, in the first year, adults are going to be better at their at their vocabulary. But what do we struggle at? We struggle with the pronunciation, we struggle with the grammar, we struggle at putting things together. And maybe that's not a surprise if you think of, the way we do it. It's exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about that. When adults acquire a second, a third, a fourth language and so on, why is it so difficult for adults to become fluent in it in the sense that they speak close to what a native speaker would sound like?
So there is quite a lot of reasons why this could be. The literacy thing, what I've told you now, is only one. It's a one theory that's now being proposed and slowly tested, and it seems like it's quite a good candidate to help explain part of the difficulties. But that's not all. One very basic thing you can think of is that the input that children and adults are exposed to is different. Children get this child-directed speech and maybe a very basic and kind of slow build-up of complexity in their language. Adults often is not the case. They go to a school or a language course, and there they are taught grammar and sentences and and how to read the time and numbers and things that children don't. The order is not the same, and the input and the amount of repetitiveness is not the same. If you think about it, a quick course in a new language is often 3 months of very condensed information. Children get maybe a year of passive exposure in their first year of life, too many words of their food and their mother, and we repeat it so often. There is no comparison. I think that's one thing, and also you can think of motivation. How much do you need to get immersed in the new community? Also, fear and shyness, which children often don't have. They just speak and maybe make a mistake, and we as adults, we have a lot of more awareness. So there's a lot, I would say, these are extra linguistic things, so a lot of things that have to do with pride and social acceptance. And there's also the idea that our prior knowledge is actually getting in the way. So the fact that we already know another language, it's already taking quite a lot of space. And when you learn a new language, you have to learn to make parallels and overcome some competition. So now if I say the word for computer and I want to teach you how to speak Hebrew, which is my native language, I would have to teach you that it's called machshev, and the next time you want to say it, you will have to suppress the word you already know and say the new word. And if your language that you're learning is very different than the language that you already speak, that can cause a lot of problems. So the fact that we already have another system, on one hand, can help us if the language is similar and if some points are the same, but it can also get in the way. Imagine learning how to... So if you play tennis for many years, and then after a while you want to learn a new sport with a racket, but that sport has a different rule and a different way to hold the bat and so on. At the beginning, you're going to have to override what you've already learned. And if you don't want to lose playing tennis, then you have to keep them both. So I think it's this type of analogy that it's not always simple to learn a new skill once you already have preferences in another domain.
Okay, so this is all very interesting because people have this idea that it is more difficult for adults to acquire, for example, a second language than for small children to acquire their first language, but the picture, it seems to me, at least from what you said, is a little bit more complicated than that, because in fact, at least in certain cases, for example, when adults go to a language school, they are able to become pretty competent in a second language faster than children become competent in their first language during their first 3 or 4 or more years of life, right?
Exactly. The differences are more subtle than just... it's really hard to say what is a native speaker. Is a native speaker someone with good pronunciation, someone with good grammar, someone with a lot of vocabulary, someone that has learned all the constructions? If you look at different parameters, adults and children can be better at different things. No doubt children are better at the pronunciation part. And maybe and some things they catch up. So maybe an adult in a foreign country, even after 5 years, may still struggle with certain grammatical and morphological things that children after 5 years have already mastered. But if you look at really in the beginning, the first steps, adults, the task at hand is much more complicated. Adults, if I have my bet is that if an adult would learn a language in the first language, just like a child, so if they would get the same repetitiveness and child-directed speech and slow, I would say that if you look at that, you're probably going to find similar competence. But again, there is always the fact that adults, we already have this prior knowledge. So that means our task is slightly difficult. That's true. And maybe if you can't override some things, then maybe you are always slightly less. But I think that's an empirical question, that exactly what you say. It's not so easy the case that adults are always worse than children. Mm-hmm. The comparison is usually immigrants, even after 20 years in the country, they don't speak perfect, the second language as perfect as a child after 20 years, who is no longer a child. That's true. But I think there it's really important to think how old they were and what kind of input they got and what was their motivation to learn the language and how was their first language similar to the second language, and many other things that I actually don't think there is a very compelling explanation that even if you take all these things under account and if everything is completely equal, then adults are still worse. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I guess that the kind of experiment that you alluded to, like trying to expose adults to a sort of motherese, I mean, speaking to them in a way that is similar to infant-directed speech. I mean, we could do that in a lab, I guess, but
Yeah.
probably we would have to expose adults to that language through long, very long periods of time, similar to when children are exposed to their first language, right? So
Yes.
it
Yes.
would be a little bit complicated to do, right?
Yeah, you could do this. There are two. There is one study that's already been done by the lab of Arnon. What they've done is they exposed adults to segmented versus unsegmented speech. So if you just have the sentence all together, or when you first learn the words, and I think the result was in support of what we were talking about before, that it actually helps in the long term if you learn it in a childlike way. But yeah, it's really hard to look at a very long period of time in which children learn a language. That's not a very valid experiment. An interesting thing to think about is, for example, there is an interesting prediction that maybe illiterate people might be faster at learning a second language than literate people. Again, not in the very beginning, because literacy gives us a boost. It gives us a really fast way to represent vocabulary and words and so on very easily. But maybe if you look at grammar or other things, you might find a disadvantage, but no one has looked at this, so it's
Yeah.
hard to tell.
Yeah, and the fact that written language helps us acquire spoken language, does it have something to do with memory? Because, for example, I was just thinking that if I'm hearing other people, then I have to remember myself the words that they use. But if I'm learning a new language in a language school, for example, I write down the words, and if I forget something, I can go back and read the word as it is. So does it have something to do with that? Do we know anything about that?
So it's definitely having written language gives us another way to represent the word. So if you think about the word cat, you have maybe an image of a cat and the sound of a cat. But if you are a literate person, you also have the way cat is written. Definitely, it's another thing that we have now learned and stored. And that thing doesn't go away. So indeed, the medium of writing is I would say it's above and beyond time. When we speak, we have to think very quickly of what we want to say, and once we say it, it's gone. When you write, you sometimes have days and sometimes years to think about what this sentence you want to write, and once you've written it, it's there forever. So it's a really different. When we talked about the temporal thing before with the auditory and statistical learning thing, this is a really different. So statistical learning for writing looks much more like the visual statistical learning than the auditory statistical learning. So it's a representation of language, but it's a different system with a different, with kind of a structured sequencing in space. And a lot of the time, writing doesn't fit the way we speak, right? So if you think about languages like English, that the spelling doesn't really match the sounds, and there's a lot you need to learn. So I would say it gives you a powerful tool to help with memory and so on, but it also takes something. It takes time to learn. It's not easy. There are a lot of people with great spoken language, but dyslexia or other problems. So you can see that it's not a one-to-one mapping between spoken language and written language in many aspects, including cognition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very fascinating. I think that when I asked you about why was it so important for us to study child development, one of the things that you said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was that by studying how children acquire language, we might also get some new insights into language evolution or how language has evolved. Were you referring to evolution in the biological sense, that is the kinds of mechanisms that we had to acquire during our evolutionary history to be able to acquire and produce language? Or were you referring to the cultural evolution of different languages?
That's a spot-on question, because I think the answer is unknown. A lot of people will argue, at least in the field where I come from, is that language evolved in the process of cultural evolution. So language evolves in a cultural way, and it's not about, we don't need any gene to change or any brain structure in order to have a change from for example, from a one-word stage into a three-word stage. Nothing has to change in our genetics or in our biology. But I do want to say a caveat is that this is a mystery. We don't know. We don't have access to the brains of our ancestors. We don't have access to the brains of ancient humans, and therefore we do not know whether they were lacking something. But I think it's fair to assume, even when you look at primates that have, for example, been taught sign language. They didn't have a language before, and then they were taught sign language. So, for example, the jump to one word learning and maybe even two-word learning, they didn't need to have any genetic change to them. All they needed was someone to teach them. The next stage is whether they can actually use this thing fluently with grammar the way humans do. This they're unable to do. But it's still a question of what is it they're missing. Maybe it's still a cultural thing, because maybe it takes many generations of apes signing in sign language to develop grammar, and we don't know. So I think that is still a mystery, but from I would say an empirical mystery. So we don't have the data to say whether it's for sure biological or for sure cultural, but we have a lot of evidence from the cultural evolution field that shows that these things do tend to evolve over generations by cultural transmission. So that gives support that maybe we don't need to assume the biology. It doesn't mean it wasn't true, but it's not necessary. You see biological evolution, you see cultural evolution of languages doing exactly these stages, right? So going and becoming more complex and more systematic over time, developing rules, developing grammar. This can happen in a lab experiment in a few hours. So yeah, I think I would go for the cultural evolution, but I don't have, I cannot know for sure, and maybe the only reason we can see this is because we have already been biologically adapted to go through these stages. But the truth is that no human, even with all the adaptations, no human is born with a full-fledged language. So whatever it is, it needs to develop over time.
Mm-hmm. And from a phylogenetic perspective, I mean, comparing humans to other animals and trying to understand where a particular trait came from, like, for example, language. Are there any animal models that are good to use for us to understand or try to understand what are some of the basic cognitive mechanisms that we have to have set in place for us to be able to acquire and produce language?
Yeah, there are many different types of animal models. Depends on what is it that you are interested in learning. So, for example, vocal learning, which is seems to be something that we need to do. So we need to be able to imitate sounds that we hear. And of course, there's also a whole field and whole populations of people with sign language. But then we have to have basically mimicking of shapes and body movement. And I think that is maybe more ancient than vocal learning, so the ability to copy a behavior. But vocal learning is something that, for example, people, at least at the Max Planck, they study with bats, which seems to be they seem to be a very good model for vocal learning. You can also think of songbirds, whales. There are a lot of other animals, but when we want to focus our attention to groups that are, as basically as you pointed out before, genetically similar, more similar to us, and seem to be in the lineage of our evolution, then of course we turn to primates. Looking at other apes and monkeys to see what is it that they do. So there is work with with bonobos, for example, that have quite sophisticated cultural systems. And it's already been shown, and I have to say this is something to acknowledge. All animals communicate, all of them, in different ways. None of them have, of course, this weird language that we have now, not that we know of. But they all communicate about complex things. They all exchange information, whether it is in the smells or hormones they leave on trees, whether it is with sounds, whether it is with body language. They communicate a lot with I think it is bonobos. They've already been shown to have also words for saying things. So a word for snake, or a word for something like "be careful, lion." Definitely. So it's important to keep in mind that when we look. I think the idea that you need some markers for our language is an interesting one, but the basic kind of default stage of being social, communicative, wanting to exchange information, this is a very ancient thing that many animals have.
Mm-hmm. And what are the kinds of insights that we can get by studying sign language?
So one thing is that we can maybe decouple the idea that language has to be vocal, has to be spoken. If you look at sign language communities, those languages are as complex, sophisticated, and systematic as any other spoken language. And therefore, whatever these mechanisms, innate or learned or whatever, domain general or not, whatever these are, they have to apply as well to sign language. So that gives us a way to kind of decouple what is essential, what is necessary for the general abstract idea of language, and what is only maybe related to one part, so the vocal part. So it gives us, I think, a broader understanding on what these secret mystery mechanisms we're looking for actually are, how flexible they are as well. That's one thing. Studying sign languages also gives us a really, I would say, a unique opportunity to study language evolution, because emerging sign languages are a field that it's a growing field. There are newly emerging languages emerging in different communities around the world even today, and those are the only languages that we know that are evolving at this stage. So we have access to something that in spoken languages has happened thousands of years ago, and that's really insightful to see what type of structures develop over time. For example, this idea that you start with very simple utterances and maybe over time go to things like relative clause. This we can see in sign languages as well, and these emerging sign languages. That first, if you want to say even something with three arguments, like the boy gave a gift to the girl, a lot of the time in the young sign languages, this sentence would be split in two. So boy has gift, gift to girl, or something like this. I think my example is not actually right, and sign language researchers would now correct me, but the idea I'm trying to convey is that even these languages seem to have gaining complexity over generations of speakers. Until the point where more mature sign languages, like British Sign Language or American Sign Language, are indistinguishable in their structure and complexity from any spoken language. So it actually also doesn't happen so slowly. It's these languages are, I think, 150 or 250 years old. That's enough. And the third thing, I think, is also to ask questions about the evolution of language, in the sense of, were the first languages spoken? Were they gestured? Was it a mix of both? This is yet another mystery in language evolution, because, as I said, we don't have access to these ancient languages. Interestingly, you mentioned this when you talked about literacy. The first languages we have access to only started when languages became written. This invention of written language about 5,000 years ago allows us now to study these languages, but everything before that time point, we don't know how it sounded, we don't know how it looked like. Since we humans did not evolve so much in terms of biology, I would say it's likely that our languages looked somewhat similar. Maybe language is also a mirror for cultural and society differences, so it's really hard to tell. And no one knows. It seems that there is advantages for why language would be spoken and why languages would be signed, and many advantages for why it would be both, which is what we're doing now. Our languages today are spoken, but we use so many gestures when we talk, and those gestures help a lot. And in fact, people find it really hard not to do them. So I think looking at all this together might give us a better understanding of what is it that we're even studying, and how did it start. Language acquisition, sign languages, they're all different ways to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And what about Creole languages? I mean, what are Creole languages and what can we learn from them?
So Creole languages is a very, I would say, politically loaded name for languages that evolved in specific conditions by something like a merge between languages of different people. So the typical scenario for Creole languages is, for example, either a trading scenario where two groups of people speaking different languages meet under trading circumstances and have to communicate with each other. And sadly, the more frequent scenario is conquering and slavery. So one group of people comes to a new area and basically enforce their language on the locals and the natives, and some hybrid evolves. A lot of the time, I would say the problem with talking about Creoles, as I said, is that it's a politically loaded term, because it was very popular in the beginning of the last century, where people just, I would say, ignored the socio-political problems that happened from the environment in which Creole is created. So, for example, Creoles usually it's a merge usually between two languages, maybe more, with one language being the dominant language. It's often called the lexifier language. But what made one of the languages the dominant one? Well, those are definitely historical and political reasons, and not something fundamental about the language being stronger or better or so on. This is just the circumstances. So I think Creoles give an interesting window to extreme language contact. What happens when people need to come up from scratch with a system? But I would say studying it needs to be careful, because a lot of the time the circumstances that led to this they're not natural, in the sense that there is usually a power struggle between the people, and maybe one language is considered to be less, or considered to be it's the slave language, or and therefore the variations that come to it. Basically, we can learn how extreme language contact, I would say, kind of creates a new variant, but it's not a clean scenario. And a lot of people even say that Creole languages are so simple and so on. And I think these statements have a lot to do with judging also the people who speak Creoles. So it's tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. And let me ask you a question related to that. When we talk about different languages, what are we comparing exactly? Are we talking about the official language as it is supposedly written and spoken according to the grammatical rules that are established? Are we talking about language as people use it, or what exactly? Because I guess that even talking about, for example, Portuguese, there's you have grammars. You can look in the grammar what is the proper way to say this or that, but then how people use the language and how it evolves over time is much more complex than that, than the rules that we establish formally, right?
Yes, for sure, because those rules are frozen in time and spoken languages are not. That's part of the problem of having a grammar book written 60 years ago. Yeah, the book stayed the same, but the language has changed. So if there is, and I'm sure you've already heard this, if there is one universal truth we can say for all languages around the world, and this is a big one because there is nothing universally acceptable to be really true amongst all languages except one thing, and that is that all languages, if they are used, they are changing. Language change all the time, all of them, unless they are dead. If they have no native speakers and no one speaks them from childhood to adulthood and to interact, yeah, then they are frozen in time, like Latin. But there is one thing we know, that if people use the language, it will change, no matter what the grammaticians want to, no matter what the institute wants to, and whatever people try to enforce it, it will change. And I think for psycholinguists or people who go to study linguistics and not there, in Hebrew there are two different words for this. One is linguistics, it's the study of languages and so on, and the other one is something like a tongue. So it's studying the rules and grammars of the language. I'm going to put something like literature. I'm going to put that aside and say, if you study linguistics, the first thing they teach you when you come to the first week in your bachelor's study is that leave all your judgments behind. Throw them off the window. Language is what people use, what the way people use them. Even there are of course certain rules at a certain point in time. So if you look at language, at English in 2020, there are things that are acceptable and things that are not acceptable. There are grammatical rules that people comply with, and if you break them, it doesn't sound good. But maybe these rules will change in 200 years. Who knows? So, and many of them do. So language is what people use, at least when you come to study things like psycholinguistics and language evolution and language development, and many things that have been considered ungrammatical maybe 100 years ago are now fine. Even think about past tense in English, things like learnt, that is now learned. This has been normalized now. When I studied English in school, they told us it's not allowed. But now you hear this everywhere, TV, news anchored, and I'm sure that if they will write a new book for grammar in 50 years, it will be learned and not learnt. Yeah. And many other things. So yeah, so language, unless you ask I would say a very strict person, a grammar professor, it's pretty clear that languages change. Any attempt to freeze it in time and say this is how it should be and it should always be like this, yeah, doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. And this is very interesting because I was just thinking that we have had grammar books. It is something very recent in our history, and even more so in our revolutionary history. So until very recently, there wasn't any one authority saying that this is how you should speak and write this language, for example. But in a sense, people already had a sort of grammatical rules when they spoke to one another, because as we said before, parents and other older people teach children how to speak, right?
Yeah, so the whole idea of, so first of all, many communities don't have a language authority even now. Maybe there are grammar books, but it's not the case that there is a group of people saying speak like this and not like this. And grammar books are mostly used for educational purposes, and I think that's the main point. And that is that if you think of human history, even up to, let's say, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, most humans were illiterate. Even when there was a tradition of literacy and literature in language, the common person did not know how to read and write. And this is true sometime in communities even now. So really over time, and I think this is again related to history, it's related to the Industrial Revolution and the idea that around 200 years ago, when industries formed, it was suddenly very important to teach children. Well, I mean, even schools, it's a new concept. Schools exist for 250 or 300 years. That's it. Before that, there were no school. Children did not go to learn in a classroom from 8 until 4 specific topics. This happened because of Industrial Revolution. Until then, you learned in your house the profession of your parents or so on. If you were lucky or came from a rich person, maybe they sent you to another village to learn from another maester or a pottery artist or whatever, to learn their thing. But there was not a specific organization that taught basically languages and math and history and so on to all the children. So once these formations and institutions were established, because you needed to have workers, people to work as clerks and people to work as secretaries and people to work as a construction or a factory, like a machine operator. Once the professions were so that the parents cannot teach you this because they don't know it, as that's not what they worked in. Or that there is more flexibility. Maybe your father operates this machine, but now you can learn to operate many other machines. You're not tied to that background. Then you have schools, and then you also, for schools, you need to have material to teach. And if you want to teach children how to read and write, well, then someone had to write a book describing the grammar at that time. And then it stacks. I suspect that language changes much faster if there are no grammar books to say you should teach that, you should talk that way. I think before schools and the educational system became so widespread, language was just the way it was. Just people speak it and maybe it changed. And if you're an old person and you hear the young people speak, you might think, oh, this is not the way I speak. It already changes, sometimes even within a generation. So maybe you have some judgment on that, but every generation has it. So their grandparents thought this about them. So it's, yeah.
Well, we already know since the mid-2000s that with the introduction of cell phones and text messaging, we will lose all of our languages.
It's really interesting because I actually find, I think the opposite. I think text messaging has introduced back into written language something that it was really missing. It made written language much more similar to spoken language. So far, written languages was, it's a way to write, a book or a letter or something that's basically a monologue with yourself that has no expression of emotion. As we do when we speak, you can see my face, you can see if I'm smiling, or if I'm angry, if I'm surprised, and all this. Written language has none of that. This is why a lot of the time people misinterpret the tone and so on. And if you think of then the way we use text messaging now, we use it in a much more dynamic dialogue, ping-pong way, just as we talk, so texting and SMS. And emojis, they reintroduce something that was missing. You can write a sentence and have a wink emoji, and then everyone knows that you put your face there, or have a gesture like this, or and so on. So really, it actually made the written language, I think, more rich and more close to the way we used it when we speak.
Mm-hmm. And is text messaging as grammatically complex as the language, the spoken language itself? Do we know something about that?
I don't know about that, but I'm pretty sure that, so unlike a book or a letter, text messaging, as I said, is a much more close representation to the way we speak. And just as in spoken language, I don't have super complex sentences with 5 embedded clause in them. It's also likely that a text message, at least when written in a conversation, not when I write a message to my mom that she sees it tomorrow, I would suspect that it has the grammars of spoken language, which are usually more simple. Yeah, we just don't, you have a limited space in your memory to produce and comprehend things. So, but I don't know of a systematic investigation of the complexity of text messaging. I think, again, it really relates to, are we now in a conversation, in a chat, or are we just writing messages to each other with the differences of hours, for example? Then, yeah.
Okay, so let me just ask you about one topic that you're very interested in your work, that is how social structure affects the evolution of languages and the grammatical structure of languages, for example. So what are the aspects of social structure or the way society is organized that you studied and that influence the cultural evolution of languages?
So in my PhD, I looked at two things in this context. One is the population size, so the size of your community. How many people are there? Are you coming from a very big community or from a very small community? The second thing I looked at was network structure. So that is the connectivity in the group. So you can imagine two groups which are the same size, but one of them is very densely connected. Everyone knows everyone and interacts with everyone very frequently. And another is kind of sparse. Not everyone knows each other. There are some strangers and so on. So these two things are things that I studied in my PhD. But they are not the only features that are relevant. You can think of, for example, geographical spread, so how far away do people live from each other. And you can think of basically the identity of the learners, the people in the community, which relates to what we talked about before with second language learning. Is the language, if you think about a small isolated community, a lot of the time the people who learn this language are only children. But if you think about the bigger communities, maybe with the more sparse connections, then it's very likely that there will also be some language contact. So basically people from a different group that also interact with these people. And then you have more adults learning this language as a second language, which, because of this struggle that we were talking about, could have effects on, if there is enough people that learn the language as a second language, that might actually have an impact. But I did not get to study that, sadly, because my PhD was finished before I could do that experiment. But I looked at the size of the population and how people are connected. What I found was that the size of the population has a really interesting effect on the way languages evolve and the structure of these languages. And the way, how dense and connected the network is, that didn't seem to have an effect. But I'm not sure that that's really the case. I think this was one experiment, one of the first experiments to look at this. It had some problems, and it also was done in a very small community. So maybe this effect of network structure only comes when you have bigger groups. But the size of the community seemed to have already a very interesting effect on languages.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us more about that experiment that you've done? Because I guess that's interesting to explore a little bit more.
Yeah. No. So what I've done is I've had a group communication experiment. Basically, people were coming to the lab in groups, and they had, over the course of several hours, they needed to create a new artificial language to communicate with each other. So they could not use any of the languages they already know, like Dutch or English. They couldn't point or gesture or use pantomime, nothing. They had to use their laptops and a keyboard and basically come up with a new language to interact with each other. And they needed to talk about different types of scenes, which they also have never seen before, so they don't have words for them in their language. It's basically some funny shapes, and they were moving on the screen in different ways. And they had to communicate this to each other. So there was one group in the lab, and they interact in pairs. So for example, maybe in the first round, I talk to you, and two other people talk to each other. And then after we speak for a while, we swap, and then you speak to the other person and I talk to them, and so on. Like, we mix the people in the group. And an interaction is usually basically a guessing game. So I get the scene, it's moving like this, and I have to think, how is this called? Or, yeah, and I write something, and then I show it to you, and then you have to guess what scene I mean. You have many options. You're like, okay, this, she said Baba, it's this one. And if it's correct, then we get a point, and we get, yay, success. And if it's incorrect, then we get to learn. You see what I meant, and I see what you chose, and then okay, no. In our heads, of course, we don't talk about it. And then after, the interesting thing about this type of experiment is that at the beginning, yeah, people are just guessing randomly. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just typing things and pressing. They have no idea. But over time, over the course of a few hours, they start establishing a convention. So maybe it's one time that you guessed that I said Baba and I meant this, and you guessed it, maybe by chance. But now we have one word together. Now we both know that Baba is this scene. And now we can take it on. So maybe if I see another scene that looks a bit like Baba, and I want to tell you it's that scene, but it's not Baba, I can do Baba Booba, something. And then maybe if you're clever, you understand what I mean, and so on. And what we see is that after the course of about 4 hours, these groups develop grammars. They develop regularities. Basically, they come up with specific words to describe the shapes, and other words or morphemes describe the direction in which these shapes are moving to on the screen, and then they combine them. So if I want to tell you that there is a shape, I don't know, number 1, going in this direction, I use the word for shape number 1 and the word for this direction, and I give you basically a grammatically structured word that you can guess. And what we do in this experiment, or what I do, was to look at a few things on these how these languages developed. I looked at, first of all, did people understand each other? You would expect that at the beginning they don't understand so much, but by the end of the experiment, yeah, they should be able to guess each other's words perfectly. We looked at how converged the group is, so whether it is really the case that conventions were formed, so different people in the group use the same words. It doesn't have to be the case, because you can think of dialects or every person being stubborn and I'm going to use my words and you can use your words and so on. We looked at stability. That's basically how much did the language change over time, and how structured it was. So whether this language was systematic and grammatical, so it reflects the meaning in a predictable way. And the cool thing about this paradigm is that what you do, first of all, you can see how language evolve in a real time in a community. You start with nothing, and after 4 hours, you end up with a grammar. It's amazing. And the second thing is that you can see what happens when you change the way the group is structured. So what I did is, in one experiment, I changed how many people were in the group. One group was a small group, it had only 4 people. And the other group was a bigger group, and it had 8 people. And of course, those 2 groups are very small compared to the real world, but the language is also very small, and the things people need to communicate about, and the time. So everything is miniature, and even what we find is that by doubling the number of people, if you can take this and extrapolate to another community where you double the number of people, this already has a really big impact on the language. Mm-hmm. And the result was that the languages of the bigger groups are more systematic. They end up with more structured grammars. And this result is what we hoped for, because this is what real languages, what the pattern of real languages. When we look at languages around the world now, and this is work by Gary Lupian, the person I'm working with now, and Dale, they have a beautiful study where they looked at thousands of languages around the world, and they tried to correlate their, say, the complexity and systematicity of their grammar and morphology with the size of the population. And they find this. They find that languages that are spoken in small communities tend to have a very complicated grammars that are not very systematic. They have a lot of irregulars or a lot of patterns that are really hard to learn. But the bigger communities seem to have very systematic, structured, and often simpler grammars. And this is actually what we find if you think of a very structured language as being simpler or easier to learn, because it's, yeah, it has a rule. It's much easier. Then this is exactly what we find in the lab.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So the types of experiments that you've done, we can extrapolate to what would occur in a natural environment, because, I mean, they basically correspond to that, right, as you said?
The idea is that these experiments should be able to be scaled up. So in the experiments, people have they speak to 4 or 8 people. They speak about 23 different meanings with only 2 axes, so shape and direction. That's it. And they have 4 hours to do this. In the real world, you speak to dozens and maybe hundreds of thousands of people. You talk about thousands of things that have thousands of different dimensions, but you also have a lifetime to do this. So the idea is that if we scale everything up, then we get to a real scenario. In the lab, we cannot do this. Everything in the lab is miniature. In most experiments, even when you look at language processing or language learning, it's always something very small, something that you can do as a test, as a test case in 1 hour. So you take a pattern, you scale it down, you make it small and miniature, and you see what happens. I have to say, it's not 100% clear that things would scale up linearly. So maybe not all of these components have the same growth rate. So maybe if you the proportion between how many words you need to learn and how many people you have to talk to is not the same like in our experiment. Of course, it's not necessarily the case, but I believe it is, and especially because the result we find seems to be what happens in real natural languages. So that gives us an idea that that these things are actually, I would say, ecologically valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's that thing that in the lab it's easier for us to have more control over the factors and isolate them. That is, the experiments in the lab have more internal validity, but less external validity because, I mean, they usually do not match what things would be in a natural environment. But if we go and do field work, for example, it's the other way around. So
exactly. So the reason we did this experiment in the first place was because you looked at the study that looked at thousands of languages. They found this correlation, but in the real world, you cannot know if it's really about the size of the population. There are so many things that are confounded with population size, because the bigger communities also tend to be more sparse, and the bigger communities also tend to have more language learners that are adults, and the bigger communities maybe are also geographically more spread. So how do you know that it's really this one factor that you want to talk about and not all the others? So what we do when we take it to the lab, we have a unique opportunity to tease apart and manipulate very carefully only one thing and see what happens. Of course, to do this, we also lose other realistic patterns, but this is exactly this trade-off. You want to have something that's very controlled, that you can give a very precise conclusion as to what is the effect of factor X on this. And when you go in the wild, yeah, factor X is also together with factor Y, Z, A, and B. How do you know? So, yeah, it's always this kind of trade-off between ecological validity and precision. You can think about it, carefully controlled. I think this experiment was, I am biased obviously because I worked for many years on this. But I think it was a good first step into doing such experiments in a controlled way. This can go. We can think about ways to improve it. You can do these studies online with bigger groups of people. You can do these studies in a virtual reality environment, which is something I'm working on now, to have even more validity, like that it looks more real and maybe pointing and so on instead of pressing a keyboard. There are many things that could be done to kind of stretch the experiment to make it even better.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, about the kinds of experiments that you are doing now? You mentioned virtual reality, for example.
Yeah, so one thing I'm working on in collaboration with David Peters and Hans Bosker here at the Max Planck is to adapt this paradigm for virtual reality. There, what we will do is we will have people situated in, it's called a cave. It's basically, it looks like a virtual forest. And you have, instead of shapes moving on the screen, people will talk about different types of kind of fantasy creatures that are also moving. Maybe they're bouncing, maybe they're flying, and so on. And instead of typing to each other messages, we will look at what happens when you have to vocalize about it. So not using language, but think about gibberish or nonsense vocalizations, or if you have to gesture. And then we see what would happen, how these languages would evolve in different kind of settings, with using something that is more realistic. Another thing that we want to do is to see how language adapts to environmental pressures. So if you think of things like noise, what happens if people have they're in the forest and there is very loud wind that makes sounds like S very hard to detect. So if people have a language that evolves in this windy forest, will their language not have a lot of S sounds? Because those sounds are not reliable, you can't perceive them. We think that yes, this will exactly what will happen. Or if you think about a language, gesture language that is, and we make the lighting in the cave very poor. So we make the cave kind of dark. Then the gestures would have to maybe be bigger or more salient, because the language would have to adapt to these conditions. So that's one of the things we're looking at now. So basically how, just like language adapts to fit the social environment, will it also adapt to fit the physical environment? And basically it's still people's communicative needs, and they have to be able to express them in different types of places, so using different types of ways.
Mm-hmm. So that's those are examples of things that fall under the rubric of what you mentioned before when you mentioned geography as another aspect of that would influence how languages evolve, right? And
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's already, just like the Lupien and Dale study, there are studies by Everett and colleagues that show that languages adapt to things like climate. So languages that are spoken in very dry and cold climates seem to not develop a tonal grammar. So things like in Chinese, where you have ma, ma being two different words. So a language in a very dry and cold climate is much less likely to be a tonal language. And the explanation is very simple. In such a dry and cold climate, it's really hard to control the tone of your voice because of the way our basically our vocal system works. So if a language would develop a tonal distinction, it would be a very unreliable language. People will not be able to understand each other, at least as well. So it seems that we already have hints that languages seem to be adapting to the environment in which they're spoken, whether that is a social or a geographical environment.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that came to my mind when you were referring that, and that I found very fascinating when I learned about it, was whistled languages that exist in certain very how should I put it? I mean, these are basically very small communities that live in places like mountains, in mountainous environments and places like that, where they whistle their languages instead of speaking them normally as other people do, right?
Yeah, that would be a very interesting prediction or guess as to maybe what more old languages looked like. We don't know, but maybe in the past there were more whistled languages than there are now. Hard to tell.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Raviv, just before we go, would you like to mention some of the best places on the internet for people to get in touch with your work?
So I'm very active on Twitter, and you can find me with the hashtag Limor Raviv, with underline in between. For me, I find social media to be the best place to reach out to people. I mean, yeah, we write papers for our fellow scientists, but there is a whole group of people out there that are interested in these things, and we have to learn how to communicate them in a simple, understandable way. So I find social media to be, best tool for this. Because I'm now in between positions, I don't yet have a website, but people can email me whatever they want, and I'm really happy to talk and answer questions.
Okay, so again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real fun conversation, so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.